Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today it is the 4th of August, and in today's upload we're looking at advances yet again along the Triboblast border region, including Dnipro, Donetsk, and Zaporozhye. We'll then look at the Munirhad Pokrovsk agglomeration as the Russian side has entered for the first time into the Krasnolimanskaya mine. We'll also look at some unconfirmed information from Rousinar, but I won't adjust the map to emulate it. We're also going to zoom in on the battle for Siversk because I do want to do an in-depth analysis of the topography over there and of the general force disposition. I do want to look at some of the updates from there as well because it does appear that the Russian forces are advancing across an even broader part of the front line over there than was initially perceived to be the case. We're also looking at the continued developments from Torske all the way to Kupiansk. I want to give a summary of the 3rd Army Corps that the Ukrainians have established, and now they've incorporated 2 new brigades into the umbrella. So I want to explain this area of responsibility and the way in which it's going to develop in the coming months. We're going to finish off by looking at the political developments that have been unfolding over the past couple of weeks. There is a lot of drama, obviously, back and forth between Trump and Medvedev. And I do want to look at the deadline that is expiring as well and threats to China and India. So we'll cover that at the end of today's video. So let's zoom in and look at the frontline updates over here. So you can see that the Russian forces have been able to capture this yellow polygon. So it is a bit slower in tempo in relation to what we saw over the past 2 days. But this is a part of one of the salients that was sandwiched in between Novosilka and Zelenopole. So 1.82 square kilometers of territory has been seized by the Russian side over here, as the Russian forces are now beginning to close in on the much larger salient surrounding Komishuvacha. That continues to be a really important focal point for the Russian side. Looking at the vertical advance, the Russians were able to push 1.46 kilometers northwards. So, all in all, the final node that has to be taken over in this area is the village. And if we're looking at the nearest entrance point, it would be about 3.7 kilometers away. So now you have pressure that can be exerted from a really wide sector because you have this entire sort of crescent shape to utilize, and you have a lot of nearby villages that can act as forward operating posts, including Malivka to the north and Shevchenko, Vilnapola, etc. So certainly an area to look out for as the Russians do want to overrun the defense lines in the anti-tank issues, especially that are acting as a demarcation point between in this area Donetsk and over here Dnipro. And more generally, we talked about it a lot in yesterday's video, so I won't go too much into it. But also as a means of flanking from the east, the 2 layers of defense that are supposed to defend against attacks towards eastern Zaporozhye. Now let's move on to this other positional advance as the battles continue to rage in Voskresenko, and now the Russians are making their push and putting a lot of emphasis on the southern parts of the village. So they capture this open field area. You could see that from August 4th, we have a video from the 31st Mechanized Brigade, one of the most active Ukrainian units over here. They conducted grenade drops onto Russian soldiers inside the village and also some that were a bit further south to the west. You could see that they were operating in tree lines or in open fields, and they were targeted in kind. So again, Ukrainian drone crews are absolutely essential and are, again, the main reason why the Ukrainians have been able to retain control over an area like Voskresenko, and more importantly, the span of open fields located to the east. Because as I explained in yesterday's video, the fact that the Russians accumulate in the villages like Mirny, it gives them, the Ukrainians in this case, a window of opportunity to spot them and target them before they can actually overrun the Ukrainian dugouts. And that's why they're able to hold out for so long. But it always does reach a critical mass. That's what happened over here to the south with this salient. And the same thing is going to happen as the Russians continue putting pressure from the flanks to these 3 other salients. So you could see them over here on the map. I'm just hovering over them with my mouse. Moving on, though, let's look at what's going on in Pakovsk. We do have an advance, and this is from the northeastern flank of the agglomeration. The Russian forces have captured what amounts to 2.45 square kilometers of territory. So this includes the entrance into the Krasnolimanskaya rather mine. You can see it over here. There's a terracon, there's the actual industrial area, and then there's a smaller terracon and waste heap. So you can see over here, that's the extent of the facility. Here's a geolocation from August 4th of the 14th National Guard Brigade, which is one of the main Ukrainian units that is involved in defensive activities over here. I hope I could find them on my map over here. But regardless, they are involved both in drone operations, so just frontline FPV strikes on soldiers that are trying to overrun a Ukrainian position, or grenade drops, and they also have infantry deployed to these areas and have been engaged in a back and forth between Russian soldiers that are based out of Rousinar that are trying to approach areas like Chervony Liman in the mine. So for about a week, maybe a week and a half, they were successful in holding out over here. But now the Russians have been able to enter into Chervony Liman, and now today we have the video of them in the eastern part of the mine. So the 14th National Guard Brigade, their drone crew dropped actual mines. So this is different from a grenade drop because a mine they like quite literally drop an anti-personnel mine from the drone and it causes a much larger explosion. So it dropped on a house over here, or a building, I should say. And this is part of the gradual weakening of the Ukrainian sort of front line, because up until now, this is one of their strongest relative sectors. This area that spans about 3 kilometers, it's an area where they can concentrate forces on a narrow corridor, and same thing goes for the drone crews. But even here, they're beginning to suffer from some structural difficulties. They're getting undermined, and that's not to mention what's going on the northern flank, wherein the Russians have taken over Sukhotsk and are now beginning to approach via DRGs the northern outskirts of Rudinsk. But today we received footage of intense Russian MLRS bombardment of the town, so it's clear that it has not fallen into Russian hands yet, and they don't even have a permanent foothold in it at this moment in time. But they are preparing for it based on the uptick in artillery strikes. They are really laying the groundwork needed in order to then launch an assault towards the city. So that's something the Russians obviously they are planning for the time being, though they are still chipping away at everything surrounding it. That includes to the north and also now directly to the east, something that was not happening beforehand. Let's look at Rousinar. Just recently, a couple of minutes ago, information started circulating on Russian channels. So this is not confirmed that the Russians have been able to advance north of the highway and take over the eastern chunk of Rousinar and the rest of Poltavka, which will also include overrunning this anti-tank ditch. So again, not verified by any means. And then at the same time, they claim that there was this other Russian prong with a rather deep advance through an open area on a higher ridge to reach an area directly to the east of Sofivka and Toretska and the entire Kazani Turets River. So this is an area that's obviously is desirable because it would provide the Russians with a very strong eastern flank to then hook around to the west and target areas like Shekhove and Volodymyrivka and basically nullify Ukraine's current forward positions that are advantageous along the river line. So that would be interesting if it turns out to be true, but we'll wait and see. I do want to add, though, that the Ukrainians did release footage from the Rousinar area, not from an area that's currently under Ukrainian control that may have been taken over by Russia, but an area that I already have marked as Russian occupied. The 44th Mechanized Brigade is now operating on the northern flank of the Pakovsk agglomeration. I want to find them over here on the map. Yeah, here they are. So previously, they were engaged in fighting a bit to the east near you could say areas like Alexander Kalinove and even in the area between Toretsk and Yablonivka. So now they've been redirected because naturally the battles in Yablonivka are pretty much over. The requirements for infantry are a bit less intense because now they're just fighting over a few warehouses, the Kalambik Reservoir, tree lines, and trenches. So the commitments could be reduced in that area and redirected to more critical parts of the front line, even though Yablonivka itself is also extremely important. We're talking about on our relative scale right now. So the 44th Brigade has been moved a bit to the east to help prevent the northern flank of the agglomeration from sort of blooming out and becoming a broader issue that can impact an area like Dobropilia, but even more generally, this region that I've been commenting about a lot in some of the like macro commentary that I have, this open area that's sandwiched in between the Terets River and then this other wave or this other line of villages that's on low-lying elevation that includes Mykolai Pilia and then sort of converges around Druskivka. So again, a very important area because that open field, that triangular region is on high elevation and it's not well fortified to my knowledge. So definitely keep that in mind. At the same time, though, we do have a pretty large deployment of Ukrainian forces in this northern flank on paper. But I did talk about yesterday the fact that there may be an additional air assault brigade that is getting deployed to the Pokrovsk agglomeration, and that is absolutely necessary because we just haven't seen any indicator of any major movement of reinforcements into the pockets, into the salient to help drag out the fighting in the urban areas or even on the flanks. Because even the 44th Mechanized Brigade is engaged in a more peripheral struggle, which is still very important, but it's not directly related to saving the agglomeration. It's about preventing even worse consequences after it falls. So we have one example, the 120th Territorial Defense Brigade. Based on information from the past couple of days, they are fighting near the Rodinska region. They had some missing persons reports near Rousinar as well, so they've been here for a couple of days now. But again, this is sort of scraping the bottom of the barrel using a lower quality force that was previously operating near the border between Zaporozhye and Donetsk that we were looking at the beginning of this video. Territorial Defense Brigade, it's a much lower caliber force than an air assault unit or even a mechanized brigade. So that's the level of reinforcements that we're talking about, at least on a public level. But let's move on to Siversk. I want to zoom in over here on the recent updates. So even now that I've adjusted the map to show larger Russian advances, there is still a room for ambiguity, and I am being very conservative with my estimate over here because, as I said yesterday, a lot of these regions that are in between Serbia and this initial Russian initial penetration, may be in a gray zone, according to some Russian and Ukrainian sources, or could already be under Russian control. So that's not confirmed yet. But the fall of this large ridge area that's on just completely open ground, it's not fortified to any significant degree. Having that fall into Russian hands would then give the Russians a very broad front and a lot of options by which they can push forward and attack towards the Ukrainian defense line. You see over here, they have this line of trenches that is well connected and multifaceted, but there are already holes that are beginning to get poked. And because it's only one layer, it means that it can only absorb so much before the entire thing begins to fall. So now we're seeing the first test, the first contact the Russians are having with the defense line, and we'll see how really resilient it is, because obviously the structure on paper looks good. It's able to hold out, and that's good because so far they haven't had to use this. The Ukrainian forces over here, 81st Air Assault Brigade, what else is here? 53rd Mechanized Brigade is a bit further to the north near the Sobryanki Forest, but they're also deployed to here. 118th TDF Brigade, and to a lesser degree, 27th Infantry Brigade, and the certain battalions of the 10th Mountain Assault Brigade, because others are also deployed near the Oskila bridgehead. So, my point with all of this is that the Russian forces have been able to achieve an initial penetration, and this is due to the combined efforts of the 6th, 7th, and 123rd Motor Rifle Brigades under the auspices of the 3rd Combined Arms Army. And so they have been able to really turn around the situation over here after 3 years of stalemate, give or take. So you can see over here in yellow, over the past 24 hours, the Russians captured at least 6.14 square kilometers of territory, including this hamlet, Novoselivka. The Russian forces on August 3rd, actually, this video is from the 1st Battalion of the 123rd Motor Rifle Brigade, detonated an explosive. So you had quite literally one Russian soldier walk up to a Ukrainian-controlled tree line, set up this explosion, and it looks like there's a tripod that's holding on to this sort of circular sphere shape that contains the explosive material, and then he sets it off and it explodes after a couple of seconds, and it caused a really large detonation that caused damage to the dugouts, of course. And that video gave us an indication that the Russians have actually been able to push forward rather deep. And you can see over here that the advance amounts to 2.3 kilometers. And this means that they are only, let's measure it based on the Ukrainian line of contact, only about 2.36 kilometers away from reaching the southern outskirts of the city. So, in addition to the previously established route, which is now permanent, that is really pushing through a hole over here in the line, a slight hole, and is already beginning to systematically undermine and destroy Ukrainian dugouts and fortified positions. You also have this route to the north from Serbyanka, because we have footage from the 81st Airmobile Brigade targeting Russian forces as they dismount from MTLBs and try to take over the rest of the town. And that's a part of an effort to flank Siversk entirely from the north. So that's another prong. You have rumors continue to circulate about this region over here falling. And then with all of that, you have further compounding circumstances with the Russian advance occurring along the southern flank. And I think that's because even though the Ukrainian garrison over here in Siversk is admittedly tight knit, I don't know if they have the ability on the ground in terms of their ground infantry. They have very strong drone crews, obviously, but their actual assault forces, I'm not sure whether they have the gumption and basically the size to deal with multiple vectors of Russian attacks at the same time to this degree with this ferocity. And so eventually there will be one area that does break through. It could be the south. We'll look at the elevation. It could just be this initial route over here. And then from there, they'll sort of put all their effort into that, and then new weak points will naturally appear, and those will be exploited. That's basically what the Russians have always been doing with their approaches to certain medium-sized towns, like Siversk, for instance. So that's the current situation on the ground over here in Siversk. Here's a very rough sketch of the situation around Siversk. You can see how the Russian forces in recent months, but also even before that, when we look at 2022, they secured a lot of the key ridges that are used to overlook the line that you have in Siversk and all the villages southwards. So that includes the Lysychansk high ground itself, which is pretty rare to have such a city that's on rather high elevation. But you look at the border region between Donetsk and Luhansk, and also it contains this higher elevated ridge extending all the way to the region adjacent to Bilohorivka. So that region's been under Russian control for a while now, ever since the fall of that village. And now the sort of final outpost of Ukrainian high elevation in this area does consist of certain hills that are in between interfluves or ravines or gullies, whatever it may be. And you can see those gullies over here. You can see how they branch out, and you can see how the land in between does tend to be on higher elevation, of course. So those are the final holdouts where you do have Ukrainian high elevation before entering into Siversk. So these are areas that naturally the Russian forces would like to isolate and squeeze the Ukrainians out of. So they did so to a large degree with the northern ridges. But again, I'm being very cautious with my mapping of the situation, which is why I still have this region over here marked as either a gray zone or under Ukrainian control. So the fall of that would give, once again, important tactical positions to the Russian side to directly overlook Siversk. You also have, obviously, the region in between Verkhnokamianska, which is over here, and then you have like Ivanodarivka over here, I believe, and Spirny as well. So that region in between, which is currently split between both sides, is now falling further and further into Russian hands, especially following the most recent update that we talked about. So that's another area from the southeast that the Russians are seizing and are trying to use to just gain complete domination over the entrance and the actual components of the city of Siversk, which you see over here is in very low elevation. And then also directly south, there's not much movement over here. This is an area that's not really addressed by either side. So, regardless of the fact it is still on higher elevation, and as I've been reiterating a lot of the time, the the higher elevated areas to the west of Siversk, they are still very important defensive positions, but they don't really have a singular, I suppose, major city to be based out around or be built upon. So you do have these ridges over here. You could see them on the map, and it is very significant. It runs basically along the Donbass Canal and then branches out from there into various smaller outcroppings of heights. But it's basically centered around Donbass Canal, this higher elevated region. And if you remember the initial battles for Chasiv Yar, that makes sense because those same areas around Chasiv Yar were also on very high elevation. So this region is just a continuation of that. And it is a reason why the Ukrainians have this sort of support from the rear, despite the fact that Siversk is on very low elevation. And so that would naturally become the next part of the front line and would be a good fallback point for the Ukrainians as well, which they would be willing to hold on to. But then after that, it's Sloviansk itself. So very interesting dynamic over here when it comes to the topography. Around Torske, you have reports that the 52nd Rifle Battalion of the Ukrainian side is trying to conduct these mini counterattacks, trying to fight near the church area in central Torske and then near the southern parts of the village as well. So for now, the Russians do have a very strong presence over here, but I would not say that it is full control or even control over 70-80% of the village. I would not be sure of that. I'd say for the most part it is split right now, but that the Russians are in the midst of a maneuver to squeeze the Ukrainians out. And now we're seeing the Ukrainians move in their local reinforcements to try to prevent that from happening. At the same time, though, as I explained in detail in my previous video, the Russian forces are making an effort to flank Liman from the northwest. We're already seeing that develop now with the video of a Russian entrance or approach, I should say, towards Chandrikholove. So here you can see the geolocation. It amounts to zero point 0.9 square kilometers of territory captured. The 2nd Battalion of the 66th Mechanized Brigade conducted FPV strikes onto an MTLB and towards Russian infantry in an area northeast of this village, meaning that now they are, let's see, about 2.4 kilometers away from the entrance to the village. And from there, you do have sort of a checkmate for the logistics over here because the capture of the village, as we described, would cut off this entrance route from the area that's on the other bank, the western bank of the Oskil River, and the entire network of logistics and major settlements that are within Kharkiv Oblast. It would also cut off access to this road, obviously entering towards the Russian-controlled territory, and then also the direct road over here. You could see it that moves southwards and then eventually takes the left turn into Liman itself. And then from there, you only have one other real route that can be used along the northwestern flank, and it would be from Yarova, and then from there, sort of a rendezvous around Drobisheve, and then you just continue to Liman. Or perhaps you use a non-traditional route that's not a paved road, but is just already established as a local route, or you see that there's the rail line over here. And then from there, you can sort of enter into Le Mans as well. But again, you're looking at increasingly narrow and less safe options because at that point, the Russian forces would already be far closer, at the very least, in control of Chandrikholove. And I'm sure from there, they'd have efforts to take over the next line of villages and just steadily reduce the width of the corridor needed to connect between Liman and the rest of the Ukrainian positions that are north of the Siversky Donetsk River, because there could obviously be a continuing sort of movement of supplies from the south to the north, but it's going to be very difficult to do under the circumstances of crossing over the river when most of the river itself is just completely disconnected from one bank to the other. So you'd have to set up these pontoons, and forces would have to move across heavy weaponry even if it's in a retreat. In either case, it would be difficult to do. And then you have to cross through a lot of dense forestry, both the south and to the north of the river. So there are a lot of concerns when it comes to logistics, and obviously the fact that there are not many paved roads. The one exception would be this road from Raihorodok, and that spans out of the northeastern part of Slovyansk. So that could be an area that Russian DRGs would try to isolate, and that's why I was speculating about that sort of potential in yesterday's tweets. But really enough about this part of the front line. I do want to say that the Ukrainians have already created the Third Army Corps based around Azov, the Third Azov Brigade being the supreme unit, the one that is recognized as the quote unquote leader, the one that acts as the fabric of the entire corps. So Andriy Belitsky, he was the commander of the brigade, and now he's the commander of the entire corps. You can see the Azov Brigade over here as well. And this is distinct from the 12th National Guard Azov Brigade. They're two separate units. So they are also operating in this region. Belitska claims that the Third Army Corps currently holds on to an 150-kilometer span of the front line, which accounts for 12% of the entire line of contact. I don't know if that's true, though, because they don't have control over the Siversk front, because those are entirely different units. And then around Kupiansk and Oskil, it's also a different grouping. So I could just crudely measure it over here for you guys just to get an idea of how close that is to being accurate. Let's see, because right now I'm near Torske and it's already at about 130. So, it's pretty accurate. I guess there are some intricacies because I didn't fully go over the salients and highlight their exact width and exact span. But yeah, that seems to be pretty accurate. And what that means is that this area, this entire corps, has assumed a large responsibility. Even though this part of the front line is not extremely active right now, it does have the potential to potentially change due to the Russian movements in Kupiansk, due to the efforts in Liman, and then the area in between would be sort of caught in the crossfire, trying to adjust and trying to retain control over as many chunks of territory, I should say, east of the Oskil River as possible, trying to secure that bridgehead because it distracts the Russian attention and shifts it away, pins them down, and then they would not be able to use the Oskil River as a dividing line. They would not be able to focus on Slavyansk to as much of a degree. There are a lot of reasons why it's important for the Ukrainians to retain control over this portion of the Oskil bridgehead east of the river. And that's why the Third Army Corps was created. It's supposed to be a cohesive unit consisting of the 3rd Brigade, as we said, but also the 53rd Brigade, which was recently added. And they, as I said before, have a certain battalion that is operating around Siversk, but also around the Serebransky Forest. So I have them marked on the map. And actually, the 54th Mechanized Brigade is the other brigade that is a part of the tight-knit group of forces that's defending in Siversk. I forgot to mention them. Regarding the Third Army Corps, we said the 53rd Brigade, 60th Brigade, 63rd Brigade, and most likely the 66th as well should be added in given its placement. And there are a couple of other territorial defense units that are also operating in the central parts of the Oskil riverfront. So it would be prudent for the Ukrainians to add them in as well, given their stature and given their location. So that's a bit of a sidetrack talking about that dynamic, but I do want to look at the political situation for the end of this video because we received information today about a NOTAM alert for the Kasputin Yar air base and air test facility. It's the area where they do all their missile tests, the Russian side. And just to give you guys just a crude drawing of where that's located, I believe it's basically like this area over here generally, and there's a map of it, but it's within the Astrakhan region, but also near Volgograd as well. So it's a rather large open area where such tests can be done. And we all know that last November there was a NOTAM for this part where the airspace was closed, and then the Oreshnik intermediate range ballistic missile was launched from Russian territory into a industrial facility in Dnipro, which you can see over here on the map. So the same thing actually happened in May. There were a lot of concerns that the Russian forces would do something similar when they closed their airspace in this area last this May, actually May 2025. There was a report from the American embassy closing it due to threats of missile strikes, and then nothing really materialized to any significant degree. So there are different reasons why it could be happening. Definitely could be just forced posturing and pressure, and a way to just create a lot of ambiguity and questioning. It could also be due to a legitimate plan for a strike. And then that's what we saw happen last November. And that was a part of just a warning after the Biden administration allowed the Ukrainians to strike deep into Russian territory using American systems like the ATACMS. And that was the next stage of the escalation ladder, utilizing Oreshniks for the first time. Now we're seeing, once again, the escalation ladder beginning to rise a little bit because we saw that Trump had a 50-day deadline for a ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine, and he was mainly focusing his ire on the Russian side. And he then reduced it to 12 days because he was really concerned about the fact that there wasn't a willingness on the Russian side anymore to go forward with any sort of like short-term ceasefire deal. And when you look at the front line after what I explained, you could understand why, because they are currently in the process of closing in on several key cities and towns. We looked at it before: the Pakovsk agglomeration, Liman, Kupiansk, Siversk, etc. So the interests of the Russian side right now is for the fighting to continue so they can close in on those particular locations. And that's a short-term concern. And the long-term concern has never changed. It's always been the same objective they've reiterated. Even last year in the summer of 2024, they had that proposal for the Ukrainian side to withdraw from the four blasts that they have officially annexed the Russian side according to their jurisdiction. And so that's been the Russian line. And even now, it's pretty much the same. So, with both the short term and the long term interests being different from what Trump wants, naturally that increased his anger. And so he reduced the deadline. And now we've seen a lot of actions that have been pursued by him when it comes to trying to increase the sort of secondary tariffs on countries like India as a means of pressuring them and stopping them from buying Russian energy. Because obviously, right now, the EU is in the process of phasing out the imports of Russian energy. They have these like outstanding contracts that are going to last until 2027. But with the new deal, the new trade deal that we saw signed between the United States and the EU, they're going to see a lot of investment from the European side. And this is something that was pledged by Ursula von der Leyen and the EU as a whole to start buying American LNG. And that process is already in place. And this also going to have to happen through Qatar and Azerbaijan and all the pipelines that also pass through Turkey to supply the rest of Europe. So you have this like multi-year process of phasing it out against the Russian side, although it's far from over. And then India is also a massive purchaser of Russian oil. So naturally, Trump, instead of going towards the Russian side because there are already so many sanctions on them, he's trying to go at their allies and try to force them to stop as a means of pressuring Russia into agreeing to some sort of ceasefire. But so far, we have not seen an indication that India is actually going to pause. There still has not been an official announcement from the Indian government, as far as I'm concerned. But the Chinese government has already rebuffed the request, and they are going to continue with their trade relations with the Russian side, which is to be expected, obviously. And so at the same time, due to the tweets from Medvedev, that's what sort of increased Trump's temper in this regard. What happened was Medvedev was writing these tweets, sort of reminiscing about the Biden era and reminding Trump that there could be similar consequences. He said that essentially limits deadlines can be imposed on Russia, that the dynamic in Russia is completely different to Israel or Iran. He said that any sort of ultimatum is threats and pushes the Russian side towards war. And that would be directly with the United States. So then he's sort of connecting that back to some of the policies that Biden was putting in place in November that led to that initial Russian strike. That reference did lead to Trump and posting on Truth Social that he was activating two, and they have to be Ohio class nuclear based submarines, and they would be deployed to the proper regions, although it wasn't really specified. I guess it would be somewhere in the North Pacific. That seems like a good location for them. So that's the round of escalation. And now it's actually increased further because we have an announcement from Medvedev that the Russian side is going to stop with their moratorium. So they're going to end their moratorium on the deployment of short and medium range nuclear weapons. And they may take even further steps to counter Trump's recent activities. And so this is just a really recent tweet that Medvedev put out. And it's interesting because you look at what happened in the first Trump term in 2019. Trump did withdraw from the INF treaty. In turn, the Russians did the same thing. At the same time, though, you have Steve Witkoff, the special envoy to the Middle East. He is now flying to Moscow and he's going to engage in talks with the Russian counterparts. And it's going to be very interesting to see his framing because, Witkoff has always come off whenever he's discussing any sort of negotiation with an opposing side, he comes off as being one of the more pragmatic forces, at least with his public perception and the way in which he communicates with others. And so it could be a sort of good cop strategy. It could be perhaps the United States slightly shifting its stance to be a bit more conducive to the Russian side to basically convince them through some sort of benefits or through threat. We don't know, but with Witkoff, it's usually been benefits, and then that would be a way to sort of exert some form of pressure or some sorts of offer in order to receive more receptiveness about the ceasefire. But again, if you're asking for my opinion, I don't think that is going to lead to anything. But it is still interesting to see that Witkoff is going over there because of what it signals about Trump's approach. Despite the fact that he's talking very belligerently, he's still sending his most important envoy to that area. And as a final note, the NOTAM alert for August 4th to August 8th, it actually coincides with the end of Trump's deadline for the Russian side to arrive at a ceasefire agreement with the Ukrainian side. So this visit that's supposed to occur, Witkoff doing on behalf of the United States on August 6th, will be that final Hail Mary before the deadline is supposed to expire. I believe it's on the 8th. So certainly interesting to keep an eye out for, although I'm very skeptical of the sort of perception and the hype around it. But still, we're going to cover it and usually at the end of the videos. So thank you all for watching. I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.